They were one step away from ruling the world for another 100 years. But they took that step backward. This is the story of how Kodak voluntarily buried its own future.
With a subtle undercurrent of impending tragedy. In the closets of every American family, you would find them. Those identical little boxes with the bold yellow logo, promising nothing less than the preservation of time itself. This was more than just film. It was a tangible capsule of memory, a physical manifestation of a moment saved from oblivion. The Eastman Kodak Company didn't just sell photographic supplies, it sold the very ability to stop time, to hold a piece of the past in your hands. By the mid-20th century, this empire, built on the alchemy of light-sensitive silver crystals, had reached an almost unimaginable zenith. It didn't just have market share, it had a cultural monopoly. To speak of taking a snapshot was to speak of Kodak moment. The brand name had become synonymous with the action itself. They commanded a staggering 90% of the film market in the United States. Their yellow boxes were a universal constant, as American as apple pie and baseball. This was a level of dominance that went beyond commerce. It was a form of cultural hegemony. Kodak provided the lens through which an entire nation saw itself. Its birthdays, its weddings, its holidays, its simple, everyday joys. From the sprawling photo labs in Rochester, New York, they orchestrated the visual narrative of a century. They were the undisputed kings of a world they had helped create, ruling from a throne of celluloid and paper. Their supply chain was a perfectly tuned engine of perpetual revenue. You buy the camera once, but you buy the film, the chemicals, and the paper forever. It was a business model so elegant, so profitable, it seemed invincible. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The greatest threat to any empire is rarely a rival army at the gates. The most lethal danger is the revolution that brews quietly within the palace walls, born from the very genius that built the kingdom in the first place. For Kodak, the seeds of its destruction were not sown by a competitor, but by one of its own brightest minds, in a laboratory just a few corridors away from the executive suites. This is the story of how a kingdom, at the peak of its power, looked its own future in the eye, saw a threat to its throne, and chose to execute the messenger.
The year is 1975. In a Kodak laboratory, a young engineer named Steven Sasson was given a simple, open-ended task to see if there was any practical use for a new type of electronic sensor called a charge-coupled device, or CCD. What he created in response was not just a new product, it was a new reality. The device was a Frankenstein's monster of borrowed parts, a movie camera lens, a portable digital cassette recorder, 16 nickel-cadmium batteries, and an analog-to-digital converter. It weighed nearly 8 pounds and was about the size of a toaster. Its resolution? A mere 0.01 megapixels, producing a ghostly black and white image that was barely recognizable.
But the most agonizing part was the process. After taking a photograph, the image had to be read from the sensor and stored onto the cassette tape. This digital alchemy took a painfully long 23 seconds to complete. 23 seconds of worrying and buzzing, a stark contrast to the instant satisfaction of a Polaroid or the quick development of traditional film. Sasson himself later recalled the skepticism. "We didn't call it digital photography," he said. "We just called it a way to store an image using electrons instead of chemicals." It was a humble description for an earth-shattering invention. He had successfully captured light itself, not with chemistry, but with pure information, ones and zeros. When he demonstrated this prototype to Kodak's management, he was met with a wall of bewilderment. They peered at the blurry image on the television screen, a portrait of his lab assistant, and asked practical, devastating questions. Why would anyone ever want to view their photos on a TV? They wondered. How do you store these digital files? The concept was so alien, so divorced from their entire understanding of the photography business that it might as well have been magic. They saw a clumsy, expensive novelty. They failed to see the foundation of a new world being laid, brick by digital brick, right in front of them.
The reaction from Kodak's leadership wasn't just dismissive, it was strategically catastrophic. They immediately grasped the terrifying implication of Sasson's invention, but from entirely the wrong angle. They didn't see a potential new revenue stream, they saw an existential threat to their entire kingdom. Their entire empire was built on the razor and blade model. The camera was the razor, sold cheaply. The film, the chemicals, the paper, those were the high-margin blades, sold over and over again. The digital camera was a razor that never needed blades. As one executive allegedly quipped during a discussion, "But what would we sell with this camera? Air?"
And so, the corporate immune system kicked in. Instead of nurturing this disruptive child, they chose to suffocate it. The prototype wasn't developed into a product line. It wasn't showcased as a technological marvel. It was quietly ushered away, its revolutionary potential locked away in a corporate safe, a literal and symbolic tomb for Kodak's future. This was the first and perhaps most critical act of corporate suicide. It was a decision driven not by malice, but by a profound fear of cannibalizing their own incredibly profitable core business. They were the undisputed champions of the world of chemistry, and they were being asked to bet on a world of physics and computer science, a world where their immense manufacturing plants and chemical expertise would be rendered obsolete.
This decision created a cultural precedent that would haunt Kodak for decades. It sent a clear message to every ambitious engineer and product manager within the company. Don't rock the boat. Don't threaten the film business. Innovation that aligned with the old model was rewarded. Innovation that challenged it was a career-limiting move. They had successfully defended their castle from the first assault, not realizing the assault had come from within and that the war for the future of photography had already been lost in that single, fateful meeting.
While Kodak held its future hostage in a safe, the world outside was moving at microchip speed. The 1980s and 90s saw the rise of competitors who had no sacred cows to protect. Sony, Canon, Nikon. They saw the digital frontier not as a threat, but as a land grab. Sony released the Mavica in 1981, an analog electronic camera that was a clear stepping stone to the digital world. The Japanese giants were investing heavily, unencumbered by the need to protect a multi-billion-dollar film business. The most profound irony of this entire period is that Kodak was, simultaneously, a leader in digital imaging research. They poured billions into R&D, and by the late 1990s, possessed a treasure trove of digital patents. They had the technology, they had the talent, they had the brand recognition, but they were paralyzed by internal conflict. The digital division was like a neglected stepchild, constantly told to not upset the profitable film division. Brilliant digital prototypes were shelved or watered down to avoid competing with film cameras. They developed advanced digital sensors, but were hesitant to put them in products that were too good for fear of killing film sales. This is the essence of the innovator's dilemma. Kodak was listening to its most profitable customers, the ones who bought film by the pallet, and those customers weren't asking for a digital revolution. They were asking for better, cheaper film. So Kodak optimized for the present, while the future was being built by others. They were like a master of classical music, meticulously tuning a grand piano, while in the room next door, a band was inventing rock and roll. They had their hand on the button of a technological nuclear missile, but they were too afraid of the fallout to ever press it, allowing others to claim the new territory.
The new millennium arrived, and with it, the digital tsunami that Kodak had feared for 25 years finally made landfall. It didn't arrive as a single wave, but as a relentless tide. First came the affordable digital point-and-shoot cameras from Canon and Sony. They were convenient, they were fun, and they eliminated the cost and weight of film development. Almost overnight, the ritual of dropping off film at a Kodak kiosk began to feel antiquated. Then came the second, even more devastating wave, the camera phone. With the release of phones like the Nokia 7650, the camera was no longer a separate device you had to remember to bring. It was in your pocket, always. The numbers tell the story of a collapse. In 2000, Kodak was still profitable from film. By 2003, the market for photographic film in the United States was in free fall, shrinking by double-digit percentages every single year. The company was scrambling, launching a series of Me Too digital products, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. They were decades behind in mindset and agility. A dark joke began to circulate among photographers. Film isn't dead, but Kodak might be. The company was trapped in a vicious cycle. Their digital products were losing money as they tried to compete on price, while their cash cow was being slaughtered, making it impossible to fund a true transformation. They were a patient who had been diagnosed with a fatal illness years in advance, but had refused treatment, and now the disease was terminal. Every desperate partnership, every restructuring plan, every new CEO promising a turnaround was just a palliative measure. The ecosystem had changed irrevocably. Kodak was a specialist in a world that now demanded generalists, a master of atoms in a world that was falling in love with bits.
In January 2012, the inevitable finally happened. The Eastman Kodak Company, a name that had been synonymous with American innovation for over a century, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The iconic yellow logo was now plastered across news headlines as a symbol of corporate failure. The imagery was stark. Empty parking lots at the once bustling Rochester headquarters, auction notices for factory equipment, and the quiet humiliation of a fallen giant. The final cruel twist of the knife was the fire sale. To pay off its creditors, Kodak was forced to sell off its crown jewels, the very portfolio of over 1,100 digital imaging patents it had accumulated over the decades. These were the patents that represented the what could have been, the technology that could have been the foundation of their digital dominance, was now being sold to the highest bidders, companies like Apple, Google, and Facebook, for a sum of $525 million. They were literally selling the pieces of their own aborted future to survive the present. This was not a natural death. It was a protracted suicide. From the moment they locked away Sasson's prototype, to the decades of prioritizing film profits over digital innovation, every decision was a step towards this cliff. They weren't blindsided by a competitor. They walked themselves to the edge with their eyes wide open. The bankruptcy was merely the moment they hit the ground. The company that had invented the future of photography died because it loved its past too much to let it go.
Today, that very first prototype by Steven Sasson rests under glass in a museum, a silent prisoner of its own potential. It sits there, not as a triumph, but as a question forever frozen in time. It resembles a relic from an alternate future, a strange, boxy artifact that could have gifted Kodak not just another product, but an entire new century of market dominance. But instead of becoming the cornerstone of a new empire, it became a monument on Kodak's grave. The most painful part of this story is not the failure itself, but the proximity to success. Kodak didn't lack visionaries, it lacked the courage to listen to them. They held the future in their hands, felt its weight, and deemed it too heavy to carry. The story of Kodak is so much more than a simple lesson in technological disruption. It is a timeless, universal warning about the corporate psychology of success. It's a parable about what happens when a company becomes so successful at defending its past that it declares war on its own future. When the very business model that built an empire becomes a sacred cow, too precious to sacrifice, even when the world has already stopped buying milk. This is the innovator's dilemma, etched in corporate stone. They were afraid to execute their own golden goose, the incredibly profitable film business, terrified of the short-term losses, blind to the long-term annihilation. They decided to protect their kingdom from a revolution, not realizing the revolution was already happening inside their own walls. And by the time they heard the shouts from outside, the gates were already burning. This ghost camera, this phantom of a road not taken, reminds us of the most dangerous strategic fallacy, the belief that stability is permanent. It whispers from its museum display that the most perilous thing a leader can do is to stay the course, to keep their hands firmly on the wheel when the navigational stars have long since shifted in the sky. The wind changed, but Kodak kept sailing straight into the storm, confident their ship was too big to sink.
Subscribe to Business Obituaries. We're cooking up new stories of epic failures for you. Your like helps this channel grow.